You know, I never know if I should do Madam Secretary, Madam President, Congresswoman, because you have seen this issue from so many different angles, as a cabinet secretary, as the president of a City University of New York institution, as a president of a big flagship public university, and of course, as the president of a big private university. We've been talking a lot today about these intertwined issues of affordability and access in higher education at a time of profound demographic change in the country. So I want to kind of walk through some of those, but start with there are a lot of Democrats, there are a lot of Democrats running for president in 2020 in general.
Everybody except me.
Everybody except you. But many of them who are running are focusing on this issue of access and affordability. And several have proposed, particularly Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, eliminating tuition at four-year public universities well into the upper middle class, well over $100,000 family income. What do you think of those ideas? What would they be effective in expanding access, or is it more complicated than that?
It's much more complicated than that, because young people from low-income backgrounds, particularly minorities, need more than free tuition. And in fact, these free tuition programs in states, and they've done it in a variety of ways, through scholarship programs, if you have a B+ average, have in essence subsidized the middle class and the upper class. I can tell you stories about parents that say to their kids, well, go to the University of Florida and for free, and then I'll buy you a car and I'll send you to graduate school. So if you really care about access to higher education, what you're not going to do is just say free higher education for everyone.
What's a better, more targeted approach then?
Well, income related, but it's more than tuition. For those of us that led higher educational institutions, it's room, board, tuition, books, it's a stipend. And often young people have to support their families at the same time. So we have to be careful, particularly in the traditional colleges. Now, the other thing to remember is we're talking about the elite places, whether they have big endowments or not. Most people in this country that are in higher education are working and going to school. And we keep focusing on the Harvards and admissions to Harvard when the vast majority of students in this country are not finishing in 4 years, are taking a course at a time, are worried about how they're going to finance those courses because they're not eligible for free tuition or for the scholarships that are organized. The federal government is organized for the four-year colleges. We have never adjusted. You can tell from the Pell Grants. Yeah. We're just beginning to shift the Pell Grants for low-income students to part-time students, to covering the summers. And so I've always found most of the discussions about higher education about a very small percentage, when if we really care about access, we ought to worry about everybody else.
Let me ask you, you noted this, 2017 was a milestone. It was the first year that in a majority of the states, a majority of the revenue for the public colleges and universities came from tuition rather than taxpayer dollars. Came from the families, the students and their parents, rather than the community as a whole. It was the first time, as I said, that it ever happened. Why do you think states are receding as the funders of public higher education, and what are the implications of that?
You know, it's pretty scary. I saw it at Wisconsin when I was there. I didn't see it at Hunter as much, but by the time I got to Wisconsin in the 1980s, states were trying to pull back to shifting to raising tuition as a way of financing higher education. And they felt the pressure on their Medicaid programs and other kinds of programs that they wanted to fund. And frankly, higher education had lost its luster for a wide variety of reasons, but they thought they could get away with pushing tuition. Now, in some states, they couldn't. In Wisconsin, for example, they had great pressure to keep tuition down. They could cut higher education, but they couldn't shift it on to tuition because parents were used to paying tuition out of their yearly income. There's no savings in these big states that have big state universities. You don't see college savings the way you see in the Northeast because the tuitions have been so low for so long that parents have not had to plan to put money aside to pay for tuition. So it's a different culture and a different psychology. But some of it has been the pressure of Medicaid costs and other social programs.
So what do you think when an
And taxes, keeping taxes down.
When an Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders say the federal government should step in and basically create matching grants, something like S-CHIP, where states would have to contribute, but try to provide money to states to eliminate tuition for the 4-year, or even the 2-year, I think, as the President Obama wanted to do, and Joe Biden, I think, wants to do. Is there a role for the federal government in trying to at least reduce the tuition or hold down tuition increases?
There certainly is a role for the federal government, which it has played before in saying to the states, if we're going to give you resources or give your students resources, you've got to keep your commitment, the commitment that you currently have. You can't lower, it can't be substitutional. And I don't think the federal role should be substitutional, except where there's a national interest. If we have a national interest in increasing, for instance, the number of low-income students that go to institutions, as we obviously do in elementary and secondary, where we focus on low-income communities with Title I, or with Pell, where we have an interest, but we've got to hold the states, they've got to be held to hold up their part of the bargain. They cannot get away. They get to have low taxes, but they want to get away with literally not keeping up the quality of their institutions.
By the way, if you guys want to type in your questions, we're going to get to them in a couple of minutes. The backdrop for all of this, obviously, is the profound demographic change in the educational system. So we know that in 2014 was the year where a majority of the K-12 system became kids of color. By 2020, a majority of the under 18 population will be kids of color. And by 2023, I think it is, that a majority of the high school graduates will be kids of color. And yet, the work by the Education Trust, the work by the Georgetown, the Center on Education and the Workforce by Anthony Carnevale, shows that while the number of kids of color in higher education has significantly increased, most of them are being channeled into the institutions with the least resources.
That's exactly right.
And so what is the answer to that?
Well, one of the answers is to increase Pell Grants. You want to lower the borrowing of students, low-income students in this country. You increase Pell Grants. You increase those targeted grants. The second thing is the universities have to think about this more deeply. One of the things I did at the University of Miami with my provost, we both came from working class backgrounds. Tom LeBlanc is now head of GW. We bought out all the out-of-pocket costs for students. Let me give you an example.
Yeah.
They could go to football games, they could go to theater productions, they could go to the homecoming dance. They did not have to reach into their pockets because we remembered our own experience in college where we didn't have extra money to do all the things that other kids could do on campus. So anything that anyone could do on campus at the University of Miami did not require you to reach into your pocket and pay for. We also checked with the bookstore to see who had bought their books, because often it was not a student that was on a scholarship program. It might have been a student that had taken out some loans, their parents had made a contribution, and we had a lot of book scholarships too. So we were very sensitive
to the breadth of the
to the breadth. That's what Bernie and Senator Warren miss. They miss the total student and what it takes to be successful in a higher educational student institution, and they miss the vast majority of students. I sat in a governor's office 20 years ago, and I was waiting to talk to him. I was secretary of HHS. He was on the phone with the Senate leader, telling the Senate leader that he only wanted to pay for 5 years at the state university for any student. And I knew the state pretty well. It was a Big Ten state. And I actually walked up, tapped him on the shoulder and said, could you put him on hold? And I gave him a little lecture on what his student body actually looked like and how it took most students 7 or 8 years, because with the exception of the flagship institution, everybody else was working. So he popped on the phone again and said, listen, I think we should talk this through. Let's look at the demographics of our student body.
Interesting. Let me, before I get to the audience questions, let me try to get quickly into one other area. Education Secretary DeVos reconsidering a lot of the Obama-era regulations, particularly Title IX. I know that you have concerns about many of these changes. I want to ask you specifically about their guidance on sexual harassment, which includes sexual assaults. Her proposals push schools to kind of change the balance and put the rights of the accused equal with the rights of the complainant. You dealt with very controversial issues, at University of Miami. What do you think?
Every institution
every
I was at.
institution. What do you think of these changes? And will House Democrats try to overturn them?
Yes, we will try to overturn them. First of all, the Obama administration made a whole set of changes, and educational institutions have made all those changes. Hers are guidance. I don't think any institution in this country are going to follow them, because they would, for example, require the institution to define the boundaries of the campus as the legal boundaries of the campus. You come with me to the University of Wisconsin, and the campus spreads into the community, and we're responsible for students when they're in a fraternity house or a sorority house, whether it's on independent land or not. So, some of these things, many of the things that are coming out of the Secretary's office reflect someone that really don't understand the institutions or their experience or the traditions. So we've had her before us to testify, and she's a nice person, but boy, she really is confused about what we're doing out there, and she's hearing from the community in a pretty straightforward way. I just think too many changes are a problem. And I would stick with the Obama-era rules, see how they settle in. But it's not because I believe that the accused shouldn't have equal opportunity to respond.
Did the Obama rules go too far?
Oh, I don't think they did.
Don't?
I don't think they did. But let me say this. I have handled both sides.
Yes.
I have handled situations where one person lied about the other person, where you had to check out the facts. I never assume that one gender is right versus another gender. You just have to handle these things extremely careful. One of my problems is that universities have had to invest significant resources to handle cases carefully that are often crimes. I mean, every institution I've run, if someone committed a crime, we picked up the phone and called the police, and then hoped that the police could handle it with some degree of sensitivity, but at least we're involved in the process at the same time.
Let's go to an audience question. Post 9/11 GI Bill supports former service members as students in a more holistic manner. Can you discuss the comparisons of former service members versus traditional students?
Institutions, the very good institutions in this country, and not necessarily the elite of the elite, but they've done it too, have set up offices to handle veterans' affairs and to make sure they have all the support services that they need. I think those have been very effective in increasing graduation rates. I am not happy with the way Veterans Affairs has administered the resources. My cousin came back from Iraq, and he wanted to finish school online. He had been to a whole bunch of schools, but he had enough credits. And he went to the VA, and he got a list of the schools. He brought it back to me. I didn't recognize one of them. Half of them were not accredited. And I had a heart attack. Now, I could call the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, but what I really did was guided him to a great state university, in this case, Maryland, where he could finish his degree online and someone would recognize it. Now, they did that because those places were cheaper. And he said to me, well, Maryland is 20% more expensive. Well, I paid the difference for him. I figured that was my contribution to his service, but shoot, it gets pretty bad. They have since straightened a lot of that out, but they still steer students, veterans, towards two-year schools when they want to do an engineering degree, for example.
Let me try to squeeze in one more question from the audience. Regarding your comment on how long it takes to graduate, wouldn't many students graduate sooner if college was free, since they would not have to work as much?
There's no evidence of that, because they'd still have to work for the other pieces of going to school. I realize particularly for middle-class kids, that it sounds great that they don't have to pay tuition, but I'm talking about students who aren't middle class. And what I'm arguing is for them, if you really want to talk about access to higher education, for them, it's not enough. Not that it's not good, it's not enough.
And real quick, do you expect Democrats will pass a reauthorization of the Higher Education Act in 2020?
I do, but there'll be a difference of opinion. I think that Senator Alexander wants a narrower set of success stories than Chairman Scott. I'm on education and labor, and I think we'd like to do something more comprehensive. At the end of the day, I think that Senator Murray, who has a very good relationship with Senator Alexander, as do I, as a matter of fact, long time working together, that we're going to work something out. We're going to work something out. But there is a difference, because once you get into the majority, you really want to do something comprehensive.
Representative, Secretary, President, thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome.